Friends, good morning and welcome to day 6. I hope you're all well and enjoying the readings. There's a lot going on in today's readings. They're pretty hefty, meaty passages, so I hope you've enjoyed them. Our Genesis passage, what we see today, you remember yesterday we saw that God was just really angry at the sin and everything that was going on, and so he destroyed his creation and started again from scratch. And yet what we see today is that already people are back at their old ways and back in just their sin straight away. And today we see at Babel people trying to build a tower out of pride, really, to make a name for themselves. And they say so that they won't be scattered over the face of the earth. Remember that after God destroyed everything and started again, when Noah and his family came out of the ark, God's specific instructions were to go and to fill the earth again. And yet they've decided they don't want to do that. They want to stay together and build things and to make a name for themselves. Now, the story that we see today of Babel, I think it's more of a parable than historical fact. At the start of the story, we see it says that the whole world had one language and a common speech. And yet, if you're paying attention yesterday, in chapter 10, it says a few times that the different nations each had their own language, their own tongue, and Babylon was included in that, which is where the story of Babel is set. But it carries on, this story, the theme of the fall of man that we've seen recently, and yet civilization is moving forward, and so we see it today moving from the Garden of Eden where it had been previously, and now we're in the city in Babylon. People are inventing, they're moving things forward, and yet God is being left out of the equation. God doesn't feature in their new, if you like, modern civilization. And so where the story talks about a common language, what I think it means is that the people shared a common purpose, which was building up their kingdom, their human kingdoms, for their benefit, for their glory. And so God confuses their plans. What I think that teaches us is that when communities or civilizations are built up in defiance or in disregard of God, when God is left out of the equation, there cannot and there will not be harmony or unity or any kind of common understanding. Check out our psalm for today, verses 4 and 5. We see, "You are not a God who takes pleasure in evil. With you the wicked cannot dwell. The arrogant cannot stand in your presence. You hate all who do wrong." And yet, later on in our journey, when we get to Acts, we're going to come across the story of Pentecost. And when we get to Pentecost, we see the opposite happening. We see the people coming together with a common language and a common understanding. And that comes about when they're focused on God. Later on in our passage in Genesis, we see another family tree, which leads us up to Abram, who later on will become Abraham. Now, Abraham is kind of famous in the Old Testament and the New Testament. And so through this family tree up to Abraham, slowly but surely, we're leading closer and closer to Jesus. Then we get into chapter 12, and we see the call of Abram. And the first thing that God says is, "Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you." Now, sometimes, in order for us to be used by God, sometimes we need to leave some stuff behind that's going to hold us back and just not be helpful. That might be a lifestyle, it might be some of our friends or acquaintances that we used to have that were perhaps bad company. Just anything that holds us back. And so our proverb today in verse 15 says, "My son, do not go along with them." And yet going forward in what God says to Abraham, it shows that we won't, or we will, we're going to be better for it when we leave these things behind. Let's look at verses 2 and 3. God says, "I will make you into a great nation." Remember, God has just said, leave your people behind. But now he's saying, I will give you new people. "I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse." Basically, God's going to look after Abram. Abram's not going to come to harm. And then from verse 10, still in Genesis, we see a bit of a strange incident where through fear, Abram disassociates himself with his wife. He tells people that she's his sister so that people, so he doesn't get killed. He's out to save his back without thinking of what it will do to his wife. And so through that story, we see that it causes Sarah, his wife, and the Egyptians to sin. Because the Egyptians are then led to believe that his sister, so they take her to be their wife, and it all just goes a bit wrong. Abraham, who is known for his faith, here he seems to lose it a bit. He doesn't trust that God will look after him and his family, despite the fact that God has appeared to him twice very recently to reassure him and to encourage him. Let's move forward into Matthew. We're in the Sermon on the Mount, and Jesus teaching the disciples about a whole range of things. But yesterday and today, Jesus has been talking a lot about the kingdom of God, which is completely different to any human kingdom. And yesterday we started to look at how the kingdom of God is in us. And so today, in verse 13, Jesus says that you and we are the salt of the earth. Now, salt is a preservative. You put it on food to stop it going off and decaying. Salt, if you add it to food, adds flavour. It's distinctive. You know when it's there. It stands out from the food. Particularly when my wife cooks, she puts a lot of it in. And also salt. If you put salt on a wound, it heals. And so that's what we're here to do. And Jesus says that if we don't do that, then what's the point? And in verse 14, we're the light of the world. A light, we're there to be seen. We're there to be an example. And then in verse 16, it says, in the same way, let your light shine before men so that they may see your good deeds and praise your Father in heaven. We're there so that people see what we do. We set an example. And then when people see us, that they praise our Father in heaven. Contrast that with the people at Babel who were there. They want people to see them and praise them. The kingdom of God is very different. And then going on, we get to verse 21, and Jesus is talking about murder. And luckily, he says, don't murder. I think that's sound advice. But then he goes on to say that even anger, he says, when we get angry without cause, that's just as bad. And so we need to be people that are out to reconcile. And before we try to be spiritual, we need to be making amends and making up with anybody that we've been angry with. Reconciliation is kind of a prerequisite, if you like, of our worship. Then he goes on to talk about adultery, and again he says don't do it. But then in going on, he says even looking lustfully at a woman is just as bad. If you look lustfully at a woman, you've committed adultery in your heart. And that's just as bad. And so we need to be taking whatever steps we need to avoid lust. And then going on, he talks about divorce and just saying that you can't just divorce for the sake of it or because you feel like it. Jesus is a big one for the importance of marriage. What we see throughout the whole of Jesus' teaching is that life in the kingdom of God is very different to life in our human kingdoms. And yet it is much more fulfilling and rewarding. Remember the Beatitudes that we looked at yesterday and God's promises to Abraham today. We will be blessed if we follow life in the kingdom of God. Friends, enjoy your day, and I will see you tomorrow. God bless.